Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new here. Today's video, I'm going to be reading you a Reddit story that I found with my roommate oh God, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now. And it only just came back around into my memory because we were watching a video of one of Most Amazing's videos, and they talked about something on it, and I looked at her and I was like, oh my God, what was that story that we heard all those months ago? And so we went around, we found the story again. So I'm going to read that story today because it is one of the most amazing Reddit stories on the NoSleep feed that I think I've ever heard. And it was one of those stories that really sat with me for quite a while after I heard it and after I kind of processed everything that was going on for the story. So without further ado, story that I'm going to read is by user LTOKMD. It was written 2 years ago, and this story is called, Have You Heard the Story of the Secret NES Game Ladder to Oblivion? I'm so excited to share this with you guys. It is amazing. Okay. The internet says there are 91 unlicensed NES games, but I know that's not true. There's one more, and I've seen it. It's real. At the end of this post, I'll show you a picture of it. By then, you'll understand why I will never play it. But first, the backstory. As you probably know, when the Nintendo released its Nintendo Entertainment System in North America in 1986, it created a worldwide phenomenon. It had already sold over 2.5 million units in Japan, and the success of the system in America single-handedly revitalized the struggling video game industry. By 1990, 30% of American households owned the NES, beating that percentage that owned personal computers by 7%. Mine was one of those households. I remember my dad bringing the NES home for the first time, beaming with pride. I was in complete awe. I remember sitting in our sunken living room and playing Super Mario Bros. For hours upon hours, never sitting too close to the television for fear that my eyes would be damaged. That's what my mom said, at least. When I didn't know then that making games for the NES was big business. Part of the reason the NES was so successful is because Nintendo actively courted third-party developers for its fledgling system. And because it possessed a near monopoly on the video game market, it was able to enforce its standards and policies with an iron fist. So much so that the United States Department of Justice actually started looking into Nintendo's business practices. When the FTC got involved, Nintendo changed some of the strict terms of its agreements. By Nintendo's count, there are 671 licensed games for the NES. That list grows to 677 if you include the 3 10-gen games that were only temporarily licensed, plus the several others like Miracle Piano, which were left off Nintendo's list. To enforce its licensing standards, Nintendo created the 10 NES authentication chip. When the chip in the system detected the chip in the game pack, the game would be playable. Otherwise, no dice. As you can imagine, many companies either didn't want to pay the licensing fee or were rejected as officially licensed partners by Nintendo based on the quality of their games. Hence, the 91 unlicensed games. You can see the list of them here. And there's a link, but I'm not going to read them all. To skirt the protection of the 10 NES chip, some companies configured their hardware to create a several millisecond voltage spike that short-circuited the authenticity. Why can I not say that word today?
No idea.
Authentication chip for just a moment and allowed the game to be played. Interesting stuff, right? I thought so, and so did my dad. He He worked for Nintendo in their development and licensing department during the late 80s and early 90s, and got to experience all of this as it happened. But the story of Ladder to Oblivion does not begin with my dad. It begins with Rob, the founder and original president of LTO LLC, and his idea for a new video game. Rob was in his senior year at West Lafayette High School in Indiana when Mario Bros. Was released for the NES. Like thousands of other kids around the country, he became obsessed pretty quickly. When Rob graduated, he decided to attend Purdue University to study computer science. He wanted to make video games. Purdue's computer sciences department moved into a newly renovated building in the fall of 1985, and Rob took full advantage of it when he started college the next year. 4 years later, he graduated at the top of his class, with honors. My dad told me Rob was one of the smartest people he had ever met. Even so, Rob dealt with some personal demons. His mother raised him alone after his father was murdered in a home invasion when he was young. His mother was home when it happened, but her life was spared. The resulting trauma sent her careening through years of alcoholism and depression. Rob was neglected, as you can imagine, and eventually went into the custody of Child Protective Services. He acted out at first, but eventually rose above the shitty hand he had been dealt. When Mario Bros. Came out his senior year, he found it to be the escape he had been seeking. My dad has told me the story about the day he first met Rob a dozen times. It was May 25th, 1992. He remembered the date because the Friday prior was Johnny Carson's final Tonight Show, and Jay Leno was announced as the new host that Monday. Johnny wanted Letterman to replace him, he said every time, not that Leno fella. That Monday, he was sitting at his desk when the phone rang. The voice on the other side hesitated for a moment. "How'd you like to be rich?" the man said. My dad had heard a version of that question 100 times and typically hung the phone up immediately when he heard it. This time was different. Something in the man's voice intrigued him. "I'd love to," he joked. "Do you have a secret to winning the lottery?" The man didn't laugh. "I've got something much better," he said. "What's that?" my dad shot back. "A new type of game. One the world has never seen before." "I'm listening," my dad continued. Rob introduced himself as the president of LTO LLC, a game company. At the time, my dad had no idea Rob was the only member. Rob went on to describe the game he was working on. It was a platform game where the main character moved across the screen from left to right, collected items and power-ups, and fought enemies. At the end of each level, there would be a boss, with an ultimate boss at the end of the game. My dad explained that Nintendo already had a game like that. It was called Mario Bros. My dad said Rob told him the differences were in the details. The game would start with a young man who finds a strange wooden ladder protruding out of the ground. When he climbs down the ladder, he realizes he can't go back up again. The only way is forward. At the end of each level, the young man must fight a demon who appears in the form of someone from his past. It could be a teacher, a parent, or a friend, but the player would find out it was always someone who had harmed the main character in the past. After defeating the demon, the player climbs down to the next level. There would be 9 levels total. In each, the screens would become darker and the enemies more powerful. By the 9th level, Rob explained, the player would barely be able to see his way through the darkness. At the very end, the ultimate boss appears. The player finally learns who he's been fighting to reach the entire time, a mirror image of himself. Defeating the boss reveals a new ladder that leads back up the surface. "What happens when the player fails?" my dad asked. "You don't want to know," Rob said cryptically. "You can tell me what it's called?" "Ladder to Oblivion," Rob almost whispered. Eventually, Rob convinced my dad to meet with him in order to show him the game. It wasn't quite finished yet, but the first 7 levels were playable. "I was mesmerized," my dad told me. "The game made me feel like no game ever had before. The bosses at the end of the levels, I started seeing them as the people in my life who had wronged me. Teacher in 4th grade who humiliated me in front of my class. The old high school friend that had stolen my girlfriend. It almost felt like that game changed, depending on who played it. When my dad brought the game to Nintendo, they refused to approve LTO LLC as an officially licensed developer. Nintendo had strict rules about the type of content that their partners could include in their games. No nudity, no gore, no cursing, and no religious symbols, among others. Ladder to Oblivion's theme and content didn't fall far, and the content didn't fall under of the recognized restrictions, but it was rejected anyway. It's too dark, and that was the only explanation given. Rob was crushed. My dad said, understandably so. He'd worked on Ladder to Oblivion for the better part of 3 years. My dad told me the day of the final rejection was the last time he'd ever spoken to Rob. He never saw him again. I begged him several times to try and get in touch with Rob. Maybe he still had a copy of the game and we could play it together. Maybe, he'd say, averting his eyes. I'll see if I can dig up his number. I believed my dad all these years. For all I knew, the story of Ladder to Oblivion, the NES game that never was, ended the day my dad said it did. Yesterday, I found out I was wrong. It's hard to even type this, but yesterday, my dad committed suicide. It was a shock to my entire family. He seemed happy and never acted like he was depressed. My mother found him in the woods behind our house, the shotgun he'd used several inches from his outstretched hand. I was devastated. I still am. Last night, I went to the one place where I felt closest to my dad, his study. We'd spent hours in there together playing the old NES games and reliving his days at Nintendo. On a whim, I ended up grabbing Mario Bros. Out of its case. I was going to play a final game in honor of my dad. When I flipped the door open, I found there was already a game inside. My dad never left games inside the console. He said it made them wear out quicker. It was Ladder to Oblivion. The art was just how I'd pictured it all those years. An 8-bit image of a ladder descending into a raging fire. The note was taped on the back. The note contained the real story of Ladder to Oblivion, the NES game that did come to be. I considered transcribing the entire thing, but realized that would be disrespectful towards my dad. The note was addressed directly to me. He'd meant the words within for my eyes only. Plus, the words were dark. They aren't a proper representation of my dad at all, and I hope you don't mind that I paraphrase. The day of the rejection, my dad went and saw Rob. He was already obsessed with Ladder to Oblivion. After a lengthy discussion, Rob asked my dad to join LTO LLC as a partner. It was Rob's plan all along and was the reason he'd asked my dad at the beginning if he wanted to be rich. Together, they'd complete Ladder to Oblivion and release it as an unlicensed game. My dad knew all about Nintendo's authentication chip and how to work around it. They both understood that many of the companies that produced unlicensed games, like Tengen, Atari Software Branch, and Color Dreams, Bunch Games, Wisdom Tree, they changed their name every so often so people would forget about how crappy their previous games were. Actually did very well in the market. They knew the risk that Nintendo could come up with a solution that would lock Ladder to Oblivion out of the NES forever, but were willing to take it. Of course, my dad would be a silent partner. He still needed his job at Nintendo. It's what paid the bills, after all. In 7 months, Rob finished Ladder to Oblivion. The two were ecstatic, but their joy was short-lived. The night Rob completed the game, he called my dad and told him it was finally finished. My dad was excited beyond measure. The next day, my dad had the game loaded onto 2 pre-production cartridges. He had a friend in the art department whip up a label, complete with Nintendo's seal of quality. That way, they'd think he was working on something for the company. Once they were ready for a large production run, he'd have them made off-site. He didn't want to take any chances. Rob told him not to play the game yet. He still needed to do a complete playthrough from start to finish, to catch any remaining bugs. My dad reluctantly agreed. Rob agreed to call him when he'd finished so he could meet my dad and do a playthrough with him. 5 days later, my dad showed up at Rob's house unannounced. He hadn't talked to Rob since the last phone call, and in his paranoia was worried that Rob had decided to release the game on his own and cut Dad out of the profits. What he found was much worse. Rob was dead. I assume by suicide, but the note is unclear. There's a lot of rambling at this part about God and the devil, and a lot of sentences that have been scribbled over so heavily the words are almost illegible. It looks like Rob left a note, and the only words were never climb the ladder. More scribbled out words. At the end of the page, my dad writes, "He finally faced himself." My dad moved on undeterred. He was terribly upset at Rob's death, but the game had taken control of his life. Ever since he'd played it that first time, he said, he'd been battling a secret depression. The only thing he believed would make him happy again was to release Ladder to the public. The very next day, my dad brought on a new partner, a friend from Purdue named Eddie, who was always looking for business opportunities. That night, they got together to play the game. My dad started, but ended up leaving after the 7th level to grab some pizza. When he returned, he found Eddie dead. Game over, flashing on the screen. Eddie had taken a kitchen knife and slashed both of his wrists. The note gets harder and harder to read, but I think he carved something into his arm like UXXYINXXXE. I'm not sure what that means. He says at that point he was convinced the game was responsible for both Rob and Eddie's deaths, as well as his worsening depression. He tucked the game away, vowing to never play it again. He couldn't bear to get rid of it. I was 5 at the time. I obviously don't remember any of this happening, but I do remember us moving around that time. My dad quit his job at Nintendo and we moved out of town. For 24 years, my dad kept his promise. He never played Ladder all the way through. Until yesterday. I'll include the end of the note here. You can draw your own conclusions. I, for one, believe my dad, no matter what you all might say. And my dad never told me what happened to Rob's copy. For all I know, it's still out there. Have you seen it? 24 years of guilt finally caught up to me today. I climbed the ladder. Something I said I'd never do. I faced myself and I was judged unworthy. Just like Rob, just like Eddie. There's something wrong with the ladder. Almost like consciousness. It's more than just the sum of its parts. It looks deep inside you. Too deep for light, to the places you didn't know existed. Son, I don't want to die. I XXXX to live. But my shotgun is sitting on the floor beside me and I can hear it speaking to me. It sounds XX sweet. Its voice is an XXX in song. If I can't ignore it, I'll tear up this letter and you'll XXXXXXX the difference. I'm sorry I lied. XXXX. I'm sorry. XXX. A lot of things. Please know that I love you. Move on. I'm going outside. I can't. Please, never climb the ladder. That is the end of the story. Of course, there is a couple of comments underneath. People have written underneath like what they think all of the X's and the fill in the blanks were. And there are a lot of theories as to that, but of course it hasn't actually been verified by the person who wrote it. And yeah, Ladder to Oblivion was a story that really caught my attention, and it just goes to show how much a video game can draw you in and how incredibly terrifying it can be to just get so invested in something. I, for one, am a lover of video games. I play video games all the time. I play lots of like Assassin's Creed. I've played Black Ops. I used to play Medal of Honor and all of those games for sure. But I do also have to remind people that video games can take you into another world. And sometimes we find ourselves being lost in that world and not knowing the difference between our world and the fictional world that we get lost in, especially if you have struggles with mental health already. So please be very mindful of the games that you are playing. And of course, take the time to enjoy them. We have a very, very select few games here in the house, and it's mostly just because we have really narrowed down the ones that we love to play. We have quite a few Assassin's Creed games, if not all of them, aside from, we have everything except Unity. And we also have the Batman games, and I think the only other thing that we really have is Final Fantasy and Spyro. So that goes to show you the kind of games that we play, and it's just, yeah, we really have a great passion for learning. So learning this little tidbits of history that we can through the games that we do have, as well as great gameplay and storyline, is very important to us. So we don't just go buy every single game as it comes out. And I've never really been a fan of Grand Theft Auto or anything like that. So yeah. Let me know what you guys thought of Ladder to Oblivion down below in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on the story and what you think might be going on with that game. Is it cursed? Do you think that it's just showing you the deepest, darkest side of yourself? Or is there something more to it? Yeah. If you haven't already, please give this video a big thumbs up. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I do upload every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for your viewing pleasure. And I cannot wait to see you in the next video.